Dr. Anjali Malik. We have Dr. Hafiza Khan, Dr. Rupa Wong, and Dr. Anu Kathiresan. So we're all going to be talking to you about marriage masala. And just a quick note, if you stick around to the end of the talk, we will be sharing a link for 3 free yoga classes that have been gifted to us. So stick around for that. We're really excited to be able to support small business owners, especially in this pandemic. Business owners are really being hit hard, especially small business owners. And this is a South Asian business that we are happy to support. So good evening, everybody. How are you ladies doing?
Well, I loved listening to your online dating talk. That was interesting for me. I mean, I came a little bit after a lot of that, so that was interesting to hear all those apps.
Yeah, right. I know. I mean, I think someone was just asking about Bill Mill, which is I like the name. I don't know much about the app, but I like the name. So since we sort of have already touched on the fact that I met my husband online, maybe I'll start and then we can all go around and talk about why we are even part of this marriage masala talk. So you guys heard that I met my husband online, and I'm a South Asian, so I'm a Punjabi Hindu, and he is actually so Caucasian, so he's a little bit of Polish, a little bit of Irish, a little bit of English. Grew up in the Northeast Mid-Atlantic, and so definitely coming from two different worlds. But we met online, and we made it work. I'm also a physician, and he is currently practicing as a lawyer. He was in the military, active duty, which was a totally new world for me. He also has an engineering background. So a lot of differences in our backgrounds, but we've been able to come together and make it work. So in this group of 4 ladies, I'm what you would call the baby of the group. I'm not necessarily by age, although that might be true, but my marriage is in its infancy. So we just celebrated our 2-year anniversary. We've been together for 6 years. So, but these ladies have a much longer track record. And so I'm excited for us to be able to share some tips with each other. So we'll be discussing, if you saw the title, Marriage Masala, blending cultures, careers, and bringing together marriage. So I think, Anu, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Anu Kathiresan. I'm a fertility physician in Houston, and I'm married to a neurosurgeon who's also Caucasian. And so we met in med school, and I think it's kind of a funny story how we met. We were moving into the dorms, and I had just come from New York. I did my undergrad in New York, and we were in med school in Georgia. And so we were both moving into the dorms. He offered to help carry my stuff. And I looked at him and I was like, who would offer to help carry my stuff? Like in New York, nobody would offer to help move, things like that. So I was like, no, thanks, and kept walking. And so we ended up kind of studying in the same study groups and got to know him more. And so that's how we met. And so, yeah, I guess we've been married now 10 years. We have 3 kids. I don't know if I'm the toddler in the group now in terms of how long we've been together, but we have 3 kids. They are 2 years old, 4 years old, and 5 years old. So our life is pretty hectic trying to manage the 3 kids and also both maintaining full-time jobs. But we make it work. Things fall through the cracks sometimes, but we make it work. So I guess Rupa, are you next?
Yep, I think so. Hi, everyone. I'm Rupa Wong. I'm an ophthalmologist. I live in Hawaii and actually am in private practice with my husband, who I met in residency. So my parents are Tamil and they immigrated here in the 70s. My husband's family, his great-grandfather immigrated from China to Hawaii. So his family's been here for generations. So it's a little different because they have this Chinese culture, but it's different than Chinese people on the mainland. Like my friends, when I was growing up in North Carolina, were very different because their parents were typically immigrants, and this is not the case. So it's a little bit of a different type of culture, as well as blending in being in Hawaii and the Hawaiian culture, which kind of permeates everything. So my husband and I met in residency. I was actually a year older than him in training, but we are the same age. He took a year off, and I was his chief resident, which was very Grey's Anatomy of us. And we started dating during residency, and we finished our fellowship in Boston, and he was very miserable in Boston because the weather is very cold. If you take a Hawaii surfer boy and move him to Boston, it doesn't work out that well. So we made the decision. I gave up my job at Boston Children's, and we started a private practice. So we've been married 12 and a half years, and we're coming up on our 12-year anniversary of our practice on August 1st. We have 3 kids. They are 6, 8, and 11. So we found out we were pregnant with our first child the first weekend we moved to Hawaii to start our private practice, which was a little bit crazy. But we've just always worked together. So it's something that's really common to us because of residency. And I think now, Hafiza.
Okay, I am the senior citizen of the group. My parents immigrated here in 1966. So probably I am the oldest possible born in America Desi, because I think we were allowed in around 1965.
Yeah.
So I grew up in the 1970s, and I am Indian. Can't always tell that by my name, but my father is from Kerala. So half of my identity is a Malayali. My mother is Tamil. So Rupa and Anu, we're all Tamil girls. So I'm a South Indian Muslim, which means that we don't speak Urdu. We speak our native language, which is Tamil and Malayalam. But I'm also Muslim. And when I was ready to get married in the 1980s, there was no internet invented. So, and there were not a lot of Desi guys here. I think the explosion of immigration was mostly in the 80s and 90s with the H-1B. So I knew that it was important to me that I marry within my religion, because I am a practicing Muslim. I'm not Orthodox, but I wanted to be married to a Muslim. And the culture is important to me as South Indian. I love dosa, idiyappam, and sambar. So the language and the culture were important, but not as important as the religion for me. So there was not a lot of people around for me to choose. And as a South Indian Muslim, I have a double whammy of conservatism. Number one, my parents, came here in '66. So my parents had an arranged marriage, and my parents started looking for boys the minute I hit 18. My grandmother was 14 years old when she was married. My mother was 17. I made it to 20. So every summer in college, I would have to go to India to meet boys. And my parents, I met 2 guys that I didn't like. One was, I thought he was a misogynist, and the second one was kind of over domineering. I felt like so I had arranged marriage, meaning I met them, and then I was able to talk to them and get a sense of what they're like. And the first 2 were like, no way ever. But then my husband, by that time I was like, I'm over this. I don't want to do this anymore. But then the third time, which was, I think was about 2019, 20, they asked me to come and meet my husband, and he is a Malayali, and he's an engineer, just like my dad. He's a mechanical engineer. And so I went reluctantly, and my husband was the one. He was raised outside of India, so English was his native language. He's progressive Muslim. He didn't want a wife who wore hijab. My mother-in-law works. She was a botany teacher, so he's used to having a wife who works. So we have been married for 32 years.
Woo! Yeah, that's
Have a son,
amazing.
24. My 24-year-old son just graduated a year ago with a degree in biochemistry. And my second son is 20 years old, and he's pre-med at the University of Chicago. So I went the traditional route.
That's amazing, Hafiza, to hear your story. I mean, obviously, you know, you're so right. Your parents coming here in '66 and you having probably a very different experience. I mean, I'm sure we have a lot of similarities in maybe some of the difficulties of being an Indian child growing up in America. But I think you definitely had a different experience. But something that speaks to me about your meeting your husband and how it worked is that you were looking for someone who shared your values, and you were looking for someone who came from something that was familiar to you, and for you that was a mother-in-law that worked, and you know, someone who spoke English as their first language, which, you know, I'm sure that wouldn't have been prohibitive, but still the fact that you could both speak comfortably in English, but be Malayali, and you know, he would be comfortable with your career. I mean, most of the people in this summit, aside from two, are practicing physicians, right? And so it's really important for us to all be able to practice in whatever way that we need to, while also, you know, being married, raising families, etc. So I find that really an interesting point, that even though you had a different path than maybe the other three of us, it was similar in what we were all looking for.
Basically, my parents served as an online dating app.
Exactly. No, and you know, again, I know that I'm so sad that the audio video was a problem during the first talk, because I actually referenced that you know, shadi.com to someone like me, or maybe, you know, some of the other girls, sounds so unappealing, right? You're like, oh my God, like I would never do that. I would never do the matrimonials like in India abroad or whatever. But what do you think online dating is? You're basically like, hi, my name's, you know, Ben, and I'm 24 and I'm an engineer. I mean, it's not, it's a little bit, sometimes it's more superficial, sometimes it's less, but it's kind of the same thing, except that we get pictures, whereas in India it's like in the newspaper sometimes. So it's a similar concept. We don't want to say our parents are right, and I'm still not saying they are. But you're so right. It's that, and you're lucky.
My parents were 100% right, and
Yeah.
I have 32 years and a happy marriage to prove it. So
Right.
we have, I think there's some things that we talk about our Desi parents and
Right.
About their values and their culture, but I have to say that my parents knew me. They knew what I wanted, and they did the compatibility match for me. So sometimes our parents are right.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this talk is about marriage, but you reference in-laws, with your mother-in-law being a botany teacher, and I think that in-laws obviously play a huge part, as do our own families. So one of the questions we had talked about amongst ourselves were how we were worried about our families reacting, which of course, Hafiza, we know how yours did, since they helped play a part. But for the rest of us, for me, I had the talk early on with my parents that, you know, we grew up in America. I actually thought that I wanted to marry an Indian, but then, you know, as time went on, I thought, you know, I'm not going to do anything that's not organic. And it ended up that I didn't, that I, you know, fell in love with someone who was not Indian. But it was all about us being able to accept each other's cultures. So were you, Rupa and Anu, were you worried about your parents' reactions to a non-Indian or a non-physician? Or, well, I guess you're both married to physicians. So.
For me personally, I mean, again, this is something I'm probably in between in terms of, you know, the generation. So this is something I talked about with my parents growing up, because my mother's a psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist. My father's an engineer, very like typical Indian. They immigrated here in 1972. You know, we had these talks even in high school, like, how can you expect me to marry not just like an Indian person, but a Brahmin, Hindu, subcaste, Iyer, you know, like they get real specific, you know, Iyer versus Iyengar, like you can really go down the pipeline there. You're limiting your options. But But I was always allowed to date in high school, which actually amongst my friends was unusual. And I had my boyfriend in high school was Caucasian, Irish Catholic. My boyfriend in college was Israeli Jewish. So they were very used to me not dating Indian people. So I wasn't super concerned about that aspect with them. In actuality, even though my husband's family is many more generations here in America, or in the US, his mom was more interested in him marrying someone Chinese. And so even before, I was actually more worried about her, because he had told me, oh, she didn't like my last girlfriend because she wasn't Chinese. I'm like, I'm not Chinese either.
Yeah.
But my parents, my husband's just very yin to my yang. My parents met him and they just loved him immediately. And my husband always tells a story. My parents had flown up to New York when I was moving to Boston for fellowship. And so we all rented a U-Haul and my husband was helping. And my dad was like, Jeff, you're riding with me. So he and my dad had like a 4.5-hour conversation. And I thought it was going to be like, stay away from my daughter. And it wasn't. In fact, it was, do you know what you're getting with my daughter? She can be a handful. It was more of a warning to my husband, which it kind of signifies how much they liked him. And so I wasn't really concerned about my parents, but I was very worried about meeting his mom. And it was fine once I met her. Again, I think it's about the common values. Family is very important to us. His parents had been married, for 35, 40 years until his father passed. Like that was just part of the culture. And we have these big family dinners. And that's part of why we moved to Hawaii too. He has 3 older sisters that are 2 of them are physicians. Like we all get together and it's just very similar, except for the fact that he always thinks my family yells a lot because we're just loud compared to his side of the family. But I don't know, Anu, how was your experience?
So my husband and I are both the oldest in our families, and oldest, of the kids, and so we were kind of the ones setting the example. And I actually thought my dad would take it well. He's very liberal, and he did. My mom was a little bit more, used to her conservative upbringing, and both of my parents also immigrated in the late 70s. So it was a little bit more unusual for her, but it wasn't bad though overall. It was just a little, took a little getting used to. My husband, so he's from a Southern Baptist family, and so he grew up from a very religious household. Like they were going to church, I think once or twice a week. His social network was church and Bible school and all that. So it was actually harder for, I think, him and his family. And so, so for the first year it was, we kind of entered it. We both liked each other. We were very compatible, and so we dated because of that. But the first year it was a little hard because we both knew we didn't know how our parents would react, and so we broke up, a few times that first few years, because we kind of accepted it wasn't going to work, even though we continued dating, which probably didn't make any sense. But it's just we really liked each other, so it was hard to separate. So, but when it came time to match, that's when we had to really kind of finalize our decision if we were going to stay together and move forward. And so we did. And but like the family wise, everybody has been really, great. It was just a little bit of transition initially. Everybody, even us, getting used to it because we were, it was our first experience going through that too. So he's my first boyfriend. So I never introduced anybody else to my family, and so it was a learning curve. But now, after 10 years of marriage and 3 kids, it's great, and we all get along, and we have big family gatherings and all of that. So it's good. But it was a little bit of a uphill initially.
Yeah, and so I guess since we talked about our in-laws, I'll talk about mine a little bit. So, they, in addition to, we're different races, we're different religions, we're different careers. I have 2 physician parents, and they, mostly socialize with other physicians or other engineers, and his parents don't have the same background. And so that had actually been my larger concern, is like, oh, are the parents going to get along? And the first time he and I brought our families together, they got along so well. They talked until like 2 a.m. And it's, again, it's so funny. It's really, you cut out everything else, and it's just people who have the same values, who look at life the same way. They just enjoy each other's company. And our parents actually call each other regularly now, just for the birthdays, or just to say hello if they're in the car and they want to pass some time. And that's really what I had hoped for. I have older cousins. I'm the older of two girls, so I had other cousins that I would look up to in their relationships, and in their sort of extended families that came from in-laws that get along, and I had always hoped for that. So, you'll see my not just my in-laws, but my husband's grandmother, who will call to wish us happy Diwali, and she's like almost 90 years old, and it's just the cutest thing. Or she'll get stuff from the Indian store, just to have it for me, like when I'll come visit her. So it's just, I think at the end of the day, kind of like what we've all said, it's about families that share the same values, and that's how you make the family work and the marriage work. So when it came to the weddings, of course, I still can't believe that my wedding's over. I thought we would talk about weddings and how we got through that process, because that can, maybe not in the time of Corona, it's pretty easy, do a Zoom wedding. But how we did that. So I was really lucky in that my husband had no demands or desires in terms of, I want this kind of ceremony or that kind of ceremony. So he let me take the lead. And his mom was the same. She didn't have any expectations of there being a Christian ceremony. I would have been totally fine had there been one, but they didn't. So we sort of went the traditional Indian and Hindu route. We did the Sangeet. I think it was definitely a new experience for everyone there, from his side of the family. And then we did the traditional Indian wedding. He wore Indian clothes, as did my nuclear in-laws, as well as almost everyone else on their side. They had gotten saris and salwar kameez just for the event. They had one of the best barats I've ever seen. I'm obviously biased, but he did a really great job with that. They were really good sports about the milni, which is where the men of the two sides of the family meet and sometimes pick each other up, like it's a kind of a contest or competition. Did the whole Indian ceremony, which they were all really, really good sports in. And then the two sort of surprises. He had listened to a lot of Hindi tapes, and so he had a line in Hindi that he was very proud of. And then, not a surprise to me, but to everyone else, is that my husband and I did a dance medley, and he danced to Bollywood music, and he did some Bhangra, which we then repeated that performance actually recently at my sister's wedding. So now it's just expected that he's a good Bollywood dancer, but it was a surprise to everyone then. So yeah. What about with you guys? And how did you combine Southern Baptist and your traditions?
So it was very similar to your experience, actually. So we were both open to having two different weddings representing both cultures, and we ended up just only doing the Hindu wedding, and that ended up working out. I'm not sure of why they didn't end up proceeding, or but we kind of divided. We would take care of ours, they would take care of theirs, but we ended up just doing the Hindu wedding. And we were residents, so we didn't have a lot of time to learn a dance or any of that. So we just kind of just showed up and did what we were told for the wedding. My mom arranged it all in her home city. And so, but yeah, it was just a really small Indian wedding, and all the family from both sides had come, and it was similar, where it was a new experience for his side of his family, but I think everybody enjoyed it. And so, yeah, that's pretty much how it was.
Ours was the opposite. Ours was like an extravaganza of cultural mishmash, basically. I'm Indian, but American. So I was lucky because my brother's a year younger, but he had gotten married earlier, like 2 years before. My sister-in-law is Caucasian. So my parents got the typical, like, Brahmin, like 4-hour South Indian ceremony out of their system. And I told them that we were going to do, so we did 2 weddings. We did a Hindu ceremony in the morning, and then we did a vegetarian Indian lunch, and then we did the Christian ceremony because my husband's family is very Protestant and very religious. And then we did a dinner reception after a Chinese lion dance. We had done a Chinese tea pouring ceremony. So we basically I did the henna, even though I'm not North Indian, we did henna ceremony. So we like did kind of like every single thing. And everybody got very involved in every aspect of it, which was great. The hardest people was my mother, the hardest person for sure, because when I told her my vision for the Hindu ceremony was to have a 1-hour Hindu ceremony max, she said, well, why even bother getting married anyway? Then, like, you may as well just not even do it. Like, that was very hard for a Tamil woman to like be told that 1 hour, and that I had my aunt kind of narrating so that people could understand what was going on. Now we're doing this, we're doing the 7 steps and the toe ring and all of that, all of those things. So just for her, but that had more to do with my vision for my wedding, which I was very involved with. And the in-laws loved it, which was really great. And they loved doing like the henna at first, but it was really interesting because my sister-in-laws are very Christian. At first, they didn't even want to do henna. They thought it somehow meant something about becoming Hindu. There was a little bit of hurdles, even though my sister-in-law, my husband's wife, her husband's half Chinese, half Indian, just oddly, like totally random, but he's very Christian. So they didn't want to do henna, and then they got into the spirit and like, oh, I don't want a bindi, but then they wore bindis, so it was just, but that's how I think change happens. And when you expose people to your culture, that's how they can learn about it. Now they're very interested in participating with like Diwali and those kind of things. But we had a smorgasbord of everything. The Chinese lion dance was really fun. And then I had my co-residents and people from Boston Children's come all the way from Boston to Hawaii. The wedding was in Hawaii. And, they loved the Chinese lion dance. They loved, there's so many different things that we mixed in. We had a 9-piece band, but we also had like pipes and Indian music while the band was taking breaks. So, they just had a great time, but it was definitely a little of every single thing. And I had like 4 outfit changes for sure. So, but I did not wear a 9-yard sari because I did draw the line with my mom with that. So I'm not wearing a 9-yard sari. Thankfully, my poor Caucasian sister-in-law wore that ahead of me, so I didn't have to.
You sound like my family, where my sister got away with a lot more because I got married before her.
Yes.
And so everyone in my family, both sides, was on board for the shortened ceremony. And the pundits, she said he was like, oh, I know how kids do these days with the 45-minute ceremony. And then when he got up there for the Ganesh Puja, he did the Ganesh Puja for 45 minutes. That's before the ceremony even starts. So anyway, you can imagine when I got up there, I was like, yep, we got it. We're going around the circle. We're done. We're good. Haven't done. So Hafiza, because you weren't necessarily blending the two cultures, did you go to India for your wedding, or what happened?
Yeah, so it was blending because I don't speak any Indian language. I only know English. Because in the 1960s and 70s, it's all about integration. So I was foreign to them because I don't speak Malayalam or Tamil. And so so they were kind of wondering how American probably I would be. But I had 2,000 people in a nikah at my father's hometown of Alway in Kerala. And
Wow.
I had three very happy grandparents. I'm the oldest. And it was a joyful day. And nikahs are only about 5 minutes. So, but we have some garlands like a Jay Mala and those kind of things that are part of our South Indian tradition that are not necessarily religious. But I had 3 events that were 2,000 people each.
Wow.
That's amazing.
The oldest, and my husband's the oldest, and we were the guinea pigs. So it was
Right.
the whole there.
I can definitely relate to, and I think I saw Rupa nodding her head about how children of a certain era, when they moved to the States, you were taught English because your parents didn't want you to go to school with an accent. So
yeah, there wasn't this push, I think, when our parents, Hafizah's and my parents, immigrated in the 70s to, you know, it was just assimilate basically. But at the same time, assimilate, yet they held at home, they held on to their culture so
Right.
much more so than, you know, my cousins growing up in India. I grew up dancing Bharatanatyam, going to bhajans every Friday night, you know, I was temple
Right.
youth group chair, you know, these are the things. So in so many ways, I was more Indian than most of my cousins growing up in India. But
Yeah, there's the
Agree.
inside life and then the outside life.
mhm.
And
Yeah.
the outside life, we would never wear. I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, this little town in upstate New York. We would never, my mother would never wear Indian clothes, a sari, outside of the house, or we would, yeah, that was our inner life.
Yeah. I love the Hudson Valley area. Not necessarily, I haven't been to Poughkeepsie, but okay. So those are, you know, so we've talked about how we met, how our families met, how the weddings went, but we are four career women. And I know our stories, but I want everyone else to hear some of the struggles that we had where, you know, two professionals come together, and no matter how much they love each other, there are sacrifices and compromises that are made. So for me, I referenced it, but I met my husband down in North Carolina. He is, at that time, he was active duty military, a lawyer in the military. So JAG, if you've seen A Few Good Men, which just so happens to be my favorite movie, he is just as good looking as Tom Cruise and a lawyer. And he loves that I describe him that way. You know, I was completely unfamiliar with the concept of active duty military. That was so outside my comfort zone or my, you know, wheelhouse. And then a lawyer. I had actually had a lot of girlfriends who were lawyers, and I knew that they worked all sorts of crazy hours when they were associates, and you know, they could be working nights and weekends. And here I was, a new attending, so my first year of practicing medicine outside of training, and I was so thrilled to be able to leave at 5 o'clock or at 6 o'clock or at 7 o'clock. I was so happy that when I left the office, I was finished, and I was getting into a relationship with someone whose job didn't end. So that was something that was interesting, as well as the active duty that comes with all these restrictions. So again, I think, you know, we as when we were trainees, we're very used to restrictions. We're very used to just being, you know, chained to the job, chained to residency, chained to training, chained to learning. But first year attending, I was like, I have no one owns me. You know, if it's the weekend, it's the weekend. Whereas for active duty, particularly the unit that he was in at Fort Bragg, he couldn't go more than 100-mile radius without permission. Just there was a lot of restrictions. So that was something that was really tough for us because we were local long distance, and then he got deployed, which, you know, at any point in time, that's going to be really tough. But it was something that was, again, so outside what I knew. I didn't know anyone who had ever had a spouse or at that time, boyfriend, who had deployed. So I didn't even have anyone that I could lean into for that. And my friends were completely unfamiliar with that situation too. They weren't, I love my friends, but they didn't even do that good of a job comforting me or consoling me because none of us really knew how to handle this situation. So that was really hard. And I would say that was one of the two biggest sacrifices that we had, is when he deployed and we stayed together. And then he comes back and was going to be transferred. So it was sort of my decision, was I going to move or not? And to be fair, I had gotten that warning pretty early in our relationship when he said, you know, I'm in the military, so I'm not going to be here in North Carolina forever. And imagine, I worked all this time in training. I interviewed at all these jobs, picked the one that I thought was perfect, the one that I thought really fit my needs the best, that spoke to me the best. And a few months into that job, I meet this great guy. And a few months into that relationship, he tells me, we're not going to be here forever. And I, pretty early into our relationship, it was less than 6 months, had to decide if I even wanted to stay with this guy. Right? Like, is he worth it? Like, I worked for, you know, 14 years for this career. Is he worth So that was it. So I did decide that he was worth it. And I did decide at that point, when he got transferred, that I would also move to DC with the condition that if I was going to be making this sacrifice, that it would be the last time I moved. So he is really interested in criminal law and international law. And so he has gone into the reserves now. We live in DC. This is a city full of lawyers, so it's a good place for him to be. And so that's sort of some of the compromises that we had to make. I know you ladies have also had some similar struggles when it came to career and marriage and just balancing it all. So I'd love to hear. Anyway, why don't we start with you? How did you guys go through training?
So in med school during the match, neurosurgery at the time was an early match. And so he was going to decide where we would go if we were going to stay or match together. So he had his version of the match list. I had my version of his match list. And I don't know what he submitted, but he claims it was this hybrid of the two. But I wonder because where he ended up was like lower down on my list. But anyway, so he ended up matching in Miami. And so then I kind of had to choose. There was another program that I really wanted to go to because I was thinking not only about residency, but about fellowship. And and where he matched had no fellowship in fertility for what I wanted to go into. And so I had to choose, do I follow him or pursue what I wanted to pursue? And so I chose to follow him. And so I went to Miami, and so that was great. We had our 4-year residency there. But then when it came time for me to go to fellowship, now it was time for me to leave. So I interviewed all over the country because it's a competitive match, and I ended up matching at UCLA. So he was going to be in Miami, and I was going to be in UCLA for 3 years. So we were going to do 3 years apart. And so that was challenging. In some ways, though, we were together at that point, I don't know, at least like maybe 6 years, 7 years, something like that. So in some ways, the time apart was a rejuvenation of our relationship, and we kind of would miss each other again. And so there were some benefits to it, but we were seeing each other every 4 to 6 weeks, and that was hard. And one benefit was the 3-hour time difference. So I would get out at 5 o'clock, and he was at 8 o'clock, and he was getting out too, because otherwise, if I was on the East Coast, I'd be sitting there waiting for 3 hours before I could talk to him. So that was one little perk. But and then I found myself 35 and haven't tried to conceive, and seeing infertility patients that were younger than me. And so I started to worry about my fertility. And so we considered freezing embryos, but we hadn't tried. And so I was like, we'll try, for 6 months. We'll most likely fail, and then we'll do IVF, and I'll freeze embryos. That was my plan. I ended up getting pregnant, which was blessing, but unexpected. I wasn't expecting, that would happen so quickly. And then I had to raise my son by myself for about 10 months in fellowship. And so that was a struggle, going through like breastfeeding and up at night and all that, and also taking my written boards. And I would fly family members in to help take care of the baby so that I could study and pass my boards. So thankfully, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense I knew it was a finite period of time. I knew it was going to be 10 months, and then we could hopefully be back together in the same city. And so then another challenge was finding our jobs. And again, he wanted to do academics, and that's a more narrow job search. And so the job search again became hard. It was like going through the match again. He has places where are better for his job and what he's looking for, and then I had different things that I was looking for. And so the first job we landed in was in San Antonio, and that was good for both of us, kind of better for him. And then another job opportunity ended up opening up in Houston, and so now it was a better fit. So, and now we're doing well. I'm just honestly, I'm grateful to be under the same roof after that experience. So that was kind of our journey, but a lot of sacrifice. It's hard at being a physician. You are focused on what you want and what your plan is, and it's hard to balance that other person. And so that was a lot of learning and compromise in the road we went down. So
absolutely, I can't. That's so amazing that you were able to do that So hats off to you. So Rupa, how about, I mean, you moved to Hawaii, we know that, but tell us how that sort of went.
So Jeff and I met during residency. He was, a year below me. So we were living in New York. We were both at NYU for residency, and I matched for fellowship at Boston Children's, which was my first choice, knowing that it's also very close. So he was still finishing up, and we used to take the Chinatown bus, the $20, $15 Chinatown bus back and forth every weekend that the other person wasn't on call, and we tried to schedule it so that we would do that. And that was just for a year. And pretty much about 2 or 3 months into my fellowship, my chair had offered me a job to stay on as faculty member and join the Department of Ophthalmology. But it was also when Jeff was going to be matching for his fellowship. Luckily, ophthalmology fellowships are only a year. So I figured wherever he ends up, I mean, he was interviewing in California and some other places, like it's just a year. It's not going to be the end of the world. But thankfully, he matched in Boston at Tufts. So that worked out really, really well, except for the fact that he was then living, he went to Brown, but I think going to college and being an adult and having to like shovel snow and get your car out and drive like all over the place to all the different clinics, it's a very different situation. So he just became very unhappy with just the weather in general and the colds. So we kind of reached this point where it's like, are we going to move to the West Coast, or are we going to move to Hawaii? And I really did not feel like I would be as happy in LA or San Francisco as in Boston. Like I didn't think that I loved the department so much at Boston Children's. I didn't feel like any other academic center would be able to hold a candle to Boston Children's. Nothing against the other places, but it's just where I was born and bred. So I kind of am like an all or nothing person. It's like, well, if we're going to do it, I will give up this job, which is essentially a dream job, right? Like it's on faculty at Harvard. I have an appointment, salaried, all of that. And let's just go for broke and move to Hawaii. And the thing is, in Hawaii, there's obviously no university practice. There's no residency. Everybody kind of practices for the most part, kind of similar to what the country was like 50 years ago. It's a lot of single doctors, solo practitioners, not very many groups. So I contacted the 4 other pediatric ophthalmologists. Nobody wanted a junior partner. Contacted Kaiser. Nobody wanted a cornea specialist, him, or a peds ophthalmologist or business. So we never had any intention of working together but it was just our only option that we started the clinic together to pool our resources and to be able to make it happen, because there was nothing else out there. And it's definitely the single best decision of my life, because I don't think I would have had the flexibility that I do. I love the community in Hawaii. Most of you know that I had a nursery in my office where all 3 children were raised, and they're just such a part of the eye clinic and for our patients' lives. And I could never have achieved any of that if I had stayed in Boston, nor any of the other things, the side projects that I'm doing, like attending lounge, or there's just a pinnacle. So it was sacrifices. And I like to know, if you know my husband, don't tell him that it was a great decision, because I still like to hold it over his head that I moved 6,000 miles whenever we're fighting. Yeah, that, he's like, how many times are you going to bring that up? As many times as I want to. I'm going to bring it up. So don't tell him I said that. But I mean, it was sacrifice, but at the same time, it really pushed me out of my comfort zone and was, I think, the right decision for us as a family and for me as a person. But at the time, it did feel a little bit like a sacrifice. But I think when you make these sacrifices and compromises, you can never truly, as much as I joke about it, you cannot like hold it against the person, or else you're just setting yourself up for like a very disappointing relationship, and you're laying the groundwork for something that's going, like if you had said, I moved to DC for you, and you're not, like it's never going to be a good situation. You're going to make sacrifices in a marriage, but you view it together as a journey, and that's what we did. So that was us.
Absolutely. And I know Hafiza will probably touch on that as well, but I 100% agree that you make the decision, you stick to it, and you keep, no regrets, no resentment. No one has time for that. And if you do harbor resentment, it's going to manifest.
Yeah.
Since this is a marriage talk, it's going to manifest if you, I'm no psychiatrist or relationship counselor, but 100% resentment has a way of boiling over. So.
Yes.
So Hafiza, you are an accomplished physician as well. So I know your story, but please tell everyone else.
Yeah, so my husband moved from India to the US. So I was an undergrad at the University of Arizona, So he moved from, he was working in Chennai, and he moved to Arizona, which was totally the opposite of Chennai, but at least it was warm. So he knew I was going to be a doctor. He didn't realize that it was going to take me so many years. So I got in at UCLA because I got waitlisted at Harvard, because each summer my parents would take me to India to look for boys and not let me do research. Right now. So he moved with me to LA, and he got into a master's degree program. He's a mechanical engineer at USC, and med school. I ignored him. So he's at a new country, and I was terrified, and all I did was study. He didn't know how to drive. He had to, in the US, he had to get a driver's license. He did that all by himself because I was in the books, because I was petrified. As after 4 years in LA, I knew I wanted to be an electrophysiologist. So the best EP program was actually in San Francisco at UCSF. So after he finished, he finished a lot before I did. He moved with me to UCSF, where I was a resident and then a chief resident. So he was there for 4 years. And when I was there, I realized that the EP program was totally misogynistic. And I had not realized that there were so few women, because in LA, there were a lot of women. So the attendings were mean, and they would shout, and I'm like, what the heck is this? I don't want this. So my LA attending was now at the Brigham. So after 4 years, I told my husband, look, I can't stay here. This guy's mean. I want to move to Boston to work with Dr. Stevenson, my med school mentor, who had moved there. So he quit his job, lost all his stock options. We had a beautiful house in Burlingame that we sold, and he never lets me forget that, because it would have been millions by now. And we went to Boston, and by that time I have an infant as a cardiology fellow, and then had another child. And like Rupa's husband, he hated that Boston with a vengeance, and so did I, to be honest with you. But he worked in Gloucester, so he had to find another job, right? So each time he moves, he starts from scratch. So he would drive in the snow to Gloucester, north, and there's not just little snow, they're like a major snow. And then I was never home, because I was a cardiology fellow for 3 years and an EP fellow for 2. So a year of undergrad, 4 years of med school, 3 years of residency, 1 year of chief residency, 3 years of cardiology fellowship, and 2 years of EP fellowship. Okay. And 2 children. And just like Rupa, I got the big prize. We want you to stay as faculty, Hafiza. So clinical instructor at Harvard Med School starts with $90,000 a year. Okay. We had 2 children, and we were out in the boonies, like in Dedham, even further out, because we couldn't afford things. So he looked at that, and that was my goal. I was going to write the VT ablation chapter in Dr. Braunwald's textbook, The Heart, and I was going to be a faculty at 40 at Harvard Med School. Instead, I'm an electrophysiologist in Plano, Texas. But so he couldn't stand that place. And $90,000 for all of that, and the 2 kids, and we're in the boondocks in Dedham. So like he couldn't take it anymore. Just like, I mean, it's May, and it was like 5 feet of snow. So,
I think it's, and the sunlight too is what, like the lack of sunlight in the winter, that was just like,
it's scary. It's horribly.
Yes.
So he got into the MBA he'd gotten in a couple of MBA programs, but he got into MBA program at SMU. And so for the first time after maybe 14 years of our marriage, I gave up my dream, which was to be a faculty at Harvard, and we moved to Texas. So I grew up in New York, trained in California and Boston. The thought of being in Texas, I was like, oh, what's this? Oh, it's, guns and rattlesnakes. But we have been in Texas since I finished my fellowship. We're beginning our 20th year. I'm in my 20th year of private practice, and there was only one academic place, UT Southwestern. Their position fell through. The funding fell through. So I ended up in private practice, which I would have never guessed in Dallas. But You know, he's my life partner. So for 32 years, he's been on my life's journey with me. And to be honest with you, he does everything. I only do my I mean, I work 10 to 12 hours a day. So other than raise the kids and I have done nothing. He's done everything. Because we fell into that pattern early in our marriage. And so I'm blessed and I can't complain. I'm probably a hard person to live with, so I appreciate everything he does for me.
Well, I think it's just amazing how, everyone sees our pictures on Instagram, or I like to think that they do, and, sees these rosy family pictures or, fun vacations. But I think, the last 15 minutes aside have shown that none of us had a straight and easy path within our marriage and our careers and our combined careers. So, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of sacrifice. And I think we can all agree it takes a lot of communication. It might have been miserable for Jeff and your husband, Hafiza, to be in Boston, but I think you both can agree it would have been even more miserable had they decided to stay. Maybe not, but I think that if one party is really because Rupa, you moved 6,000 miles, but it is Hawaii, and and Hafiza, having lived in Dallas myself, I did training at UT Southwestern. It's no Northeast. It's not the young professionals of the Northeast, but it certainly has improved over time. And no income tax, and wide open spaces.
No, stereotypes that have been shattered many times in my career. San Francisco shattered many of my prejudices and stereotypes, and so has the move to Texas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think of my time there fondly, but when I showed up there also, I was like, where am I? What is going on here?